welcome to another edition of Hometown History. I am Jamie and this is Domi.
Hi.
This is our second episode. The first one we did a couple weeks ago. It is available on YouTube and witnessingyork.com. We talked about the Baptists and the Underground Railroad in York. Tonight, though, our topic is a little different, talking about soldiers and war and what can happen when people experience traumatic events. So we're going to hit the Civil War, mostly talking then about World War II, and then some contemporary industrial accidents that happened in York County. So before we go any further, if you notice, we're at a new location this time. We're at the VFW, the Editors one, but it's also in Newberry Town. So if you hear any loud noise, there's a road right behind us, so excuse the volume. We'll try to...
We're right next to the entrance, so people are going to be coming and going.
Yeah. The window right here. And another disclaimer as well. So today we're going to talk about post-traumatic stress disorder and other conditions that people experience. But Domi and we are not medical professionals.
Right.
And so we're going to be talking about these things, more about their experiences and how people felt. But we are not certified. We are not diagnosing anybody.
Right. We're not giving you medical advice.
Yep.
So.
Yep. So I thought since we're going to talk about the Civil War first, I would go into a little bit more about what is PTSD. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual number 5, it's called the DSM-5. It's been around for a number of years, since the 1950s, and in 1952 was the first time that they linked emotional health with symptoms. And so it was first called gross stress reaction. That was in 1952. It changed again in 1968 to adjustment reaction to adult life, but it wasn't until the 1980s when PTSD was first diagnosed. And that's when they linked war trauma with post-civilian life. So some of the definitions of PTSD, some of the symptoms that come along with it are involuntary reoccurring intrusive memories like dreams or flashbacks, avoiding stimuli associated with the event, negative moods like depression or memory loss, exaggerated beliefs, distorted memories, detachment, and then also change of behavior. So anger, outbursts, and these things have to affect somebody for at least a month and directly impact their social life and their job. So we're going to be sensitive today and understand that even some viewers who are watching could have experienced some trauma. So Domi and I are going to be talking about it from a historical perspective and bring it the whole way to current day. So,
yeah.
Civil War.
Yeah, so I'm a Civil War reenactor. Shout out to the 87th PA, Company C, historically recruited out of York County.
Yay.
So I'm sure there was veterans from the 87th that had PTSD, but back then they didn't have the vocabulary for that. So what we consider PTSD today, back during the Civil War, it was called acute mania, soldier's heart, irritable heart, and it could even just be called insanity. They didn't really have the vocabulary, they didn't have the understanding of what PTSD really was, and they didn't have the understanding of how war and the trauma of war really affected soldiers and civilians. If you're aware of the National Civil War Museum of Civil War Medicine, they had a groundbreaking exhibit in 2014. It was the first of its kind, and it centered on mental health and the effects of PTSD and other mental health issues on soldiers. And they didn't really understand what caused it. So these are kind of funny if you think about it. They thought that the knapsack straps could be too tight across your chest, and that could cause irritable heart syndrome.
Oh.
As a reenactor, I can tell you that the straps aren't that tight, even if you are marching a lot.
So soldiers were breathing too rapidly.
Yeah, they thought, I'm sure there were some soldiers that maybe had some bruises on their chests from carrying their knapsack. It was heavy, they carried it long distances, but that is not going to cause PTSD.
Right.
They thought just someone who was frightened, someone who got the news about the war, that was what we would consider PTSD. Obviously, the person was scared, they've been through a lot. Whether you're a soldier or you're a civilian during the Civil War, sorry about the car noises, everybody.
Burn out! Don't burn out.
So, yeah, we got a head nod. Okay, we got a fan.
Well, and I was reading that if a soldier was experiencing an attack of some sort and they couldn't fight, they were given drugs and told to go right back out.
Yeah, basically, there was no extended hospital stay for this, because you have to remember, during the Civil War, it was triage. You're getting sent in because you just had your leg shot off. You're going in because you need something amputated. You're going in because you're not savable. You're about to die.
Oh my gosh.
So if you had all of your limbs and you were coherent enough to hold a gun and to shoot a gun, you were going back out to the front lines. So just enough drugs to calm you down, stop the panic attack, and you were right back out on the front lines. And I mean, again, the civilians that suffered from PTSD, you know, here are women, their husband, their father, their sons are off to war. They're now the breadwinners at home, taking care of a farm, taking care of children on their own for the very first time. And we're probably looking at these people that are having panic attacks or having mental breakdowns that probably had PTSD. They're insane. So you ship them off to an insane asylum.
Well, and I was thinking about that. Like, if I was, because, you know, York, we were involved in the Civil War.
Yes, we were.
We surrendered to the Confederacy, and so for a while we were occupied.
Right.
So I was thinking, you know, if I was a woman and I was at home, and at the time, women weren't prepared to be business decision makers.
Right.
You know, it's just the time period. They weren't given the groundwork to be able to make those decisions. And so you're left on your own. You're a single parent. You still have to, there's not like there's a giant down the street. It's not
right.
Like
You were growing your own food.
Yeah. And so we talked about this woman named Cassandra Smith Morris.
Yes.
Did I say her name correct? Yes, Sandra Small Morris. And she wrote a diary where she talked about when the Confederates occupied York. And they said that she didn't take her clothes off for a week.
I believe it.
Because she was so scared that she kept her clothes on. And she didn't go out. People didn't go out because what would happen to women?
Yeah, I mean,
Potentially. There's no documented case in York, but so fear was there.
The women were so afraid that the soldiers were going to come through and ransack their houses, take over their houses, convert them into hospitals, convert them into officers' quarters, rape them, potentially. Although that, you know, again, no documented cases in York. It was still a fear when the enemy comes and occupies your town. You don't have control over it. I also want to highlight two soldiers during the Civil War that were from York County. One of them was a colored soldier, James Barton. So we, again, don't know for sure if he had PTSD, but it's very likely because after the war he had to fight for his pension. So you've gone through a traumatic experience, you come home and you're changed for the rest of your life, and then you have to fight your own government to get paid for, you know, putting yourself out there.
Well, and I heard that when he was serving, he got the measles.
Yes.
And then he went home, and people said that he was never the same again.
No, and even he survived the measles and was sent back, and even the soldiers that he returned to, his comrades, said he wasn't the same. He looked different, he acted different, he held himself differently, which is a, you know, that's okay. You know, so that is like a hallmark of someone that's suffering from PTSD. They're going to be changed not only physically, but emotionally from the war. And then I also want to highlight John Henry Denning. He was from York. He actually got the Medal of Honor. And if you're going to get the Medal of Honor during the Civil War, you have to do something entirely
courageous.
Extremely heroic. And, you know, he went through so much, and here he is, a decorated soldier coming back from war, and everyone said he was different. He didn't get along with anyone.
Wow.
He came home, and he was just combative, and they said he had a bone to pick with everyone.
Oh.
And was he like that before? It didn't sound like he was that bad before he went to war. And he comes home, and he's just a changed person, but because we didn't have the vocabulary, you know, we said, oh, he went insane, or oh, he's just a grouchy
soldier's
old man. Soldier's heart, irritable heart.
And that's what makes me think about, and that's why Domi and I are talking about this, because there's a lot of stereotypes that men and soldiers are supposed to be heroic and stoic. You know,
they shouldn't show their emotions,
have feelings. You know, if you cry, you're a girl, and we're trying to highlight to these issues and talk about how this isn't new. If someone's experiencing some type of post-traumatic stress, this has been happening for hundreds of years. It just hasn't been documented
since the beginning of war.
It's
been happening. And there was actually a woman in York County, Michele McKnight Baker, who wrote a book called Soldier's Heart. It's a novel. It's based on true events within her family, but it is historical fiction. And, you know, it's about two boys, two fathers scarred by war who will survive. And, you know, again, scarred by war, not only physically, but mentally. So that's a good book if you want to check it out. You know, again, it's still fiction, but it has a thread of truth throughout the entire thing. And it talks about them coming back from war and the things that they saw and having to integrate back into society, which I'm sure is one of the hardest parts of it all, because you come from a combat zone where you're 100% aware all the time that you could be killed at any moment, and you're fighting against people every day, and then you come home and all of a sudden you don't have to anymore.
Well, and that's another thing in her book too. She highlights, I think people like conflict. They like to talk about how people disagree. But this is a story of a black boy and a white boy, and they fight against the odds, and they figure out how to create a relationship, which I think is worth highlighting, which I want to commend her for that amazing work. Same with the surrender of York. I know there's a lot of contention over it, but you know, people thought at the time that they were doing what's best. And
hindsight's 20/20.
Exactly.
And in the moment, you have to make these rash decisions. And there were black soldiers that had to get along with white soldiers, and there were civilians that had to learn to live their life with occupied towns and enemy forces. And there's a lot of layers to it. I mean, trauma isn't just one size fits all. And I mean, that goes on to World War II as well. It didn't stop with the Civil War. There was World War I, World War II.
Right. So yeah, through the years, PTSD has changed its names. So as Domi pointed out, it was called Soldier's Heart, but during World War I, it changed to shell shock, gas hysteria, war neuroses. And when you think about the Civil War, there was a lot of fighting that was, it was bloody. There were examples of people being showered in body parts. I mean, it's gruesome, right?
Yeah,
and
it was.
Like horrible. And even when the war was over, they had fields that were just covered with bodies. Now, I want to be clear, most historians say that soldiers went on to live productive lives. So we're not saying that just someone, because they experienced war, that you're doomed to these things. People can fully move on and figure out mental health and be fine. But for some people, though, they did have that impact. And so World War I, here we have gas, and you can't really see your enemy, so it's a different type of fighting.
Trench warfare.
But you couldn't leave. You were stuck in these trenches. Can you imagine feeling, you remember what it was like during quarantine.
I know. And then you're in a trench, and your feet are wet, and you're getting gangrene of the feet, probably trench foot. I couldn't imagine. And, you know, just like you mentioned, war was changing, so you weren't standing right across from each other anymore just shooting a rifle. You're using poisonous gases now. And the weaponry is getting more accurate and more lethal. So
and Domi and I want to be clear, we are not comparing the quarantine to World War I. We understand there's a huge difference between combatants and non-combatants and what we went through, but as we're both, you know, I'm an educator, professional educator, and Domi is in her own way with her Facebook group and reenactment, and we feel that one way to help people understand and build empathy is to put yourself in their shoes. And so any connection that we can make, that's what we're doing here today. So you talked about then going into World War II. So World War II was the first time that officers recognized that when soldiers experienced some type of trauma, that they were allowed to go home and have bed rest before they were sent back on the battlefield.
Extended stays in hospitals.
Yes, exactly. And there is one York Countyan that we want to highlight. His name is Earl Schaefer. So Earl Schaefer grew up in Shiloh. He was best friends with a young man named Walter Miller, and they, when they were kids, he was born in 1918, so in the 20s, they went trapping and fishing and hiking, just outdoors people, right? Just love being outdoors. And so when World War II started, he enlisted in 1941. He went and served in the Pacific Theater. He was there for 4.5 years. Unfortunately, Walter passed away while he was in Iwo Jima. And so when Earl Schaefer was released in 1945, he came home, he did odd jobs, he worked as an antique dealer, he refurbished furniture, he was a carpenter, and he struggled though. He struggled with what happened to him and how he could move on with his life. So I want to quote, this is a lovely book, it's called Walking with Spring, and he wrote it. While he was in the war, his therapy was writing.
Okay, so he kept a diary.
And he was a poet, and he wrote his experiences and how he was feeling. And so there's still manuscripts online for you to go and read.
Cool.
Which is really cool. But when he came home, he said, those 4.5 years of Army service, more than half of it in combat areas of the Pacific, without furlough or even rest, had left me confused and depressed. Perhaps this trip would be the answer. He had planned a trip, and he was going to go hiking. At this time, it was in 1947. No one had hiked the AT, the Appalachian Trail. Thank you, Appalachian Trail, and it was from Georgia the whole way up to Maine. And so he said, "I'm going to walk this thing." Him and Walter, they made a pact when they were kids. Then when they were talked about it, and they were going to hike the whole thing. So he set out on his journey. And so here we have this York Countyan who was, I mean, he was a farm boy.
Right.
Like in the scene with the Civil War, right? They're farm boys.
Yeah, their kids plucked right off their farm. They probably didn't travel that far from where they live.
Yeah, and here they're going and serving.
Yeah.
And again, like I just can't fathom
Pacific Theater.
Yeah.
How much farther away from York County can you get?
Right.
Yeah, from a farm in York County.
Yeah. So he went through this horrific experience, and he came out and he found that writing and nature was the best cure. And so he started down in Georgia, and he went the whole way up to Maine, and it took him 124 days, right? And at the time, it was 2,020 miles. Now it's longer, and he was the first man to do so. So I highly recommend his book. It's how he dealt with what he went through. So that brings me to another really interesting story. So how people deal with their trauma is different. I went and interviewed this man named Dean Smith. And Dean Smith, he and his wife, Vicki Smith, preserved 95 acres in Dover with the Farms and Natural Lands Trust.
That's amazing.
Right? They believe in preserving York County green space, and they wanted to halt construction, just make sure that this area was preserved. And so I went and interviewed him. I'm on the board for the Farms and Natural Lands Trust, so I was writing an article for their newsletter. And so I went and interviewed him, and I said, why, Dean, did you preserve this land? And he started talking about his own trauma. Now, civilian trauma is different than wartime trauma. There is a difference. But he was in the York International explosion. And so he begins telling me about, I mean, minute by minute, what happened to him. And it blew my mind that here I was talking about farm, and he's talking about this experience. And so I found that a lot of people who go through these events, they want to talk about it, you know? And so he talked about it. And so the York International explosion happened in 1998. It was one of the worst workplace explosions in York County. There were a few before that, like in 1908. We had the York Rolling Mills accident, where we have 10 people that died and 20 injured from a boiler explosion. And then we had also other events too that happened in York. It wasn't just, people think of trauma like crime in the city, right? But it's not. It's all over the county.
Yeah, it could happen anywhere.
Yeah. But this was in the city, and that night, one person did pass away and 20 were injured. And he just remembers being in this explosion with sparks flying, and he couldn't see. I interviewed another man. His name is Brad Schnell. Brad Schnell was also there, and Brad talked about how he just, when the explosion went off, he dropped on the floor. He just dropped. And then his friend came over. He called him Wolfie. Wolfie came over, and he said, "Come on, man, we got to go grab onto my shirt." And they got out, and he said he wasn't the same after that. He moved on relatively with his life, but him and Dean still deal with a lot of the things that they went through. And I'm so happy that we've gotten over the stereotype that you can't talk about things. Like, we can talk about these hard issues. That's part of the reason why Domi and I are doing this. We're talking about areas of struggle, but then also redemption and how people are working through these things.
Yeah, because so often you'll hear relatives of World War II veterans who say, you know, Grandpa never talked about his time in the war. And I think it's because in that generation you didn't show that vulnerability, where they went through the same things that, you know, veterans are going through now with modern wars, but I think we're talking about it more, and I think that's what's helping. I mean, if we're gonna stop veterans from committing suicide or lashing out, you know, hurting themselves, hurting others because of the trauma that they've been through, we need to talk about it, and we need to say that it's okay to have emotions. It's okay, you know, to share that with the people that you love, with a counselor, a professional, you know, because it's not something that you should have to bottle up.
Exactly. So speaking about great conversations, our next one, so this is a part of our summer series.
We're going to keep going. You're not going to only get 2 episodes. The Golden Venture. So Jamie wrote a great article, and this is relevant to us because it happened not that far away. I mean, we're in Newberrytown. How far away do you think it happened from here?
It was in York County Prison. I mapped it. I think it was like 5 miles.
Yeah, 5 or 10 miles. Yeah.
Google that. Check us.
It's not that far. But it's about immigrants that were held with no charges for 4 years, I believe, for 4 years. So, I mean, this is a great story about York County and how we rose above racism.
And injustice.
And injustice. So I think it's really going to be interesting, and I'm ready to learn more about it. So Jamie's going to spearhead that, and I'm going to help her with it. So I'm excited. So next time, you guys, thank you for listening to us tonight. And if you want to, you can join the Editors VFW.